We have an hour and a half total. So if we have 15 minutes for each presentation, 10 minutes for comments, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A afterwards. Okay. So first presenter is Aytan Rafikhanova. See, I tested out the last name before we started, and I still managed to mess it up. Aytan Rafikhanova from Carleton University. Her presentation is From an IDP to a Prospective Returnee, Azerbaijani IDPs as members of host communities then and now. So, Aytan, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Carleton University and EURUS for this chance to participate here, and you, Paul. Let me share my screen. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. Today I'm going to do my presentation on Azerbaijani IDPs and their life after the first Nagorno-Karabakh war and after the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, as well as the attitude of host communities towards these displaced persons. As you see, the topic of my presentation is From an IDP to a Prospective Returnee. Azerbaijani IDPs as members of host communities then and now. At first, I would like to introduce what I'm going to present now. First, I'm going to shortly talk about the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, then about IDPs, their first experiences, living conditions, employment issues, and etc. Third, I'm going to examine the government policy towards these displaced persons. After that, I'm going to discuss IDPs' experiences in host communities and also whether or to what extent there was hostility and what's the current situation. Moreover, I will present my observations on social media of whether IDPs are planning to return to Karabakh after the second Nagorno-Karabakh war or not, public opinion on this issue, and whether there is a pressure on IDPs to return to liberated territories. To begin with the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, I've shared the map. It was an ethnic and territorial conflict that took place from the late 1980s to 1994 in the Nagorno-Karabakh region in southwestern Azerbaijan between the majority ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, backed by Armenia, and the Republic of Azerbaijan. Full-scale fighting erupted in early 1992, and in early 1993, Armenian forces captured 7 Azerbaijani majority districts outside the Nagorno-Karabakh and the enclave itself. The conflict produced large flows of refugees and internally displaced persons in Azerbaijan. And as a result, approximately 250,000 Azerbaijanis were expelled from Armenia, and more than 600,000 people were expelled from Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding territories. And Azerbaijan became one of the countries with the highest rates of displaced persons in Europe. Currently, I'm doing my research on these two groups, and especially I focus on migrant suffering. But today we're going to talk about on the IDPs, their life and place in society, and current situation after the Second Karabakh War. After escaping the conflict zone, IDPs had been resettled in different parts of Azerbaijan. The majority of IDPs, it's around 70%, had been resettled in big cities such as Baku, Sumgayit, and Ganja. You see these cities in the map. And Most of these refugees and displaced persons had began their life in public buildings, old trains, and refugee camps. These photos are from 1994 and late 90s. And within the first decade after the displacement, Azerbaijani government was able to get rid of all the refugee camps where IDPs were resettled and tackle the major living issues, build new infrastructure particularly for them, and solve some of financial problems. In the next decades also, we can see an upward positive tendency in terms of improvement in IDPs living and employment. Here you see special settlements for IDPs. The first one is in my hometown in the suburbs of Baku, where all my IDP friends and classmates live. I just wanted to add it also here that you can see. And populations affected by armed conflicts are frequently exposed to traumatic events, and IDPs as witnesses of a war who escaped the conflict zone had to begin their life from the beginning in a new place and in new circumstances. And after being displaced, they faced adaptation problems, poor living conditions, unemployment, which increased their suffering and sometimes prevented them to be full-fledged citizens of the country. With all the difficulties IDPs experience in their daily lives, the prospect of being able to return to the occupied areas is central to most of them. The authorities' policies on conflict resolution had the return of IDPs as a key precondition. But many authors criticize the Azerbaijani government for using the IDPs both to legitimize the claim on Nagorno-Karabakh and to use them as a state propaganda tool. Heidi Carne, for instance, in her work, criticized the Azerbaijani government, which left the IDPs in a vacuum. She argues that the authorities have left them uncertain about their future, promising them a long wait for the great return. The authors also argue that this promise of return was a key element in the authorities' obligations in the social contract with the IDPs. The government promising that the return to the occupied territories will take place soon kept the spirit of return alive all these years. The other scholars like Gureva and Husseinov also argued that IDPs were used by Azerbaijani government, and according to them, one of the significant obstacles that prevented the government from pursuing a more proactive policy aimed at improving IDP self-reliance was the government would undermine the chances of displaced to return to their places of origin by improving IDP self-reliance. As a result, the government assistance strategies have focused on subsistence aid and have thus increased IDP's dependence on such aid and undermined their self-reliance. The authors believe that unlike government's policy of naturalization and integration of the refugees from Armenia, who had no realistic prospects for return, the Azerbaijani government has been reluctant to promote local integration as a long-term solution for IDPs. The government's concern was that IDP integration into local communities might render their return to their original homes in Nagorno-Karabakh as less likely in the future, thereby weakening Azerbaijan's claim to sovereignty over these territories. Let's see if there was any hostility toward IDPs. If yes, what were the reasons of such attitude? For me, I don't think there was any serious hostility toward IDPs. After the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, all Azerbaijani population tried to help them with clothes, accommodation, food, and etc. Of course, a few years later, there was some opposition toward them, but it was not so severe and there was not any protests or strong hostility. People just were dissatisfied with the situation. But what was the reasons of this dissatisfaction? First complaints began in mid and late 90s when IDPs began to settle in the private apartments of citizens without permission. And the government also prohibited them to take the apartments back from the IDPs until their return. So people had no choice. Second, IDPs were exempted from most fees and they were also receiving state benefits, not too much, but unemployment had high rates in post-Soviet Azerbaijan before oil boom. This could be considered one of the reasons of why some people were dissatisfied with the IDPs, especially in the rural parts of Azerbaijan where unemployment is still a problem. Third, some IDPs had their own properties and sometimes several, but they used to register these properties on their relatives' names and still were getting state benefits and additional apartments, which contributed to the negative attitude and perception of IDPs. Fourth, many IDPs lived in camps, have experienced a microcultural shock in a new micro situation. They just couldn't abandon their rural lifestyle even after being resettled. And since the vast majority of them were resettled in urban regions, it sometimes caused tensions between the host communities and IDPs, especially in big cities such as Baku or Ganja. But these people had to change their place of residence, social status, material and spiritual conditions, and social environment, and abandon everything they had, houses, farms, agriculture, and settle in urban places. And leaving their rural birthplaces, it was very hard for them to get adapted to urban living style. What about now? What is the current situation? Now, majority of IDPs were provided with accommodation, and I would say most of them got adapted to their new homes and their new lifestyles. And almost there is not any problems between the host community and IDPs. So do they want to return to their native lands and live there? Actually, it's hard to answer for all of them, but as I mentioned before, return to the already liberated areas is central to most of them, especially for the elder IDPs. But it could be questionable for the younger ones because of the generational divide. And return shouldn't be viewed as the only viable option for IDPs. It's not a collective, but an individual right derived from several fundamental human rights, including the right to return home and the right to personal property. As I have observed, the Azerbaijani government also supports IDPs with their choices. Because on an individual level, IDPs may have different perceptions and preferences about the range of durable solutions to which they are entitled, including return, social integration, or resettlement elsewhere within the country. After the Second Karabakh War, and the liberation of occupied lands, all Azerbaijani population are very happy and very pleased, especially IDPs. Again, as I observed on social media, people expect them to go and settle there. It's not like a pressure on them, but as they think the death of almost 3,000 soldiers shouldn't be in vain. Fortunately, the IDPs themselves are looking forward to returning their homes, or at least now they want to do so, as I observed in the discussions in the social media. But anyway, the time will show what's going to happen in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aytan, for a very interesting presentation and also for staying almost exactly within the time limits as well. The second presentation we have today is Alexander Nesmashnyi from the the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, or MGIMO, in Moscow. His paper is entitled Gramscian Perspectives to Hegemonic Competition in Eastern Europe. Alex?
Thank you, Leah. Special thanks for Paul for moderating this session. The presentation should be on your screens now. Today, I would like to give you a Gramscian perspective on hegemonic competition in Eastern Europe. First, I must admit that it's not a finished research, but rather one still in making. In my presentation, I will start outlining two types of hegemonic struggle in Gramsci's prison notebooks. Next, his concepts will be reconsidered and brought to the international point of view. The case for applying these conceptual lens will be Eastern Europe, with special attention brought to Ukraine. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian revolutionist, a Marxist who gave an alternative to Lenin mainstream. While being imprisoned in fascist Italy, he had written notebooks which were published long after his death and encouraged a lot of Marxist thought. Gramsci coined such concepts as cultural hegemony, passive revolution, and Caesarism, which have received a lot of attention in modern political science. However, one Gramsci's metaphor, one brought from military science, is often neglected. When writing on different strategies of struggle for power in a state, Gramsci uses concepts war of movement and war of position. What are the main differences? Well, basically, while war of movement is conducted via violent actions, breaking the law, a war of position is one where the struggle is peaceful and it is aimed at acquiring as much influence in the society as possible in order to make new values and messages heard and recognized. According to Gramsci, war of position is not just possible, but is more effective in a nation with deeply rooted institutions and well-developed civil society. The examples that Gramsci himself provides are Gandhi's passive resistance campaign in India as a war of position and the Russian Civil War as a typical war of movement. Before introducing yet another concept in international relations theory, one must make sure it is absolutely necessary. There have been attempts to describe hegemonic transition, but no coherent theory of hegemonic struggle has been yet introduced. Although Alison Scott's concept of suicide trap and the recent publications on exit from US hegemony are definitely steps in direction of a theory of hegemonic struggle. Gramscian thoughts provides us with yet another useful concept. There have been quite a few research papers that employ Gramscian perspective of hegemonic struggle concerning internal affairs of state. However, almost none brought it to the international scale. A prominent exception to this rule is Robert Cox's Gramsci Hegemony and International Relations, an essay in method, published in 1983. Cox revived Gramscian hegemony and brought it to international level, but for him, hegemonic struggle remained a secondary issue. According to Cox, war of movement is impossible on international level, as he sees third world radicals as the main counter-hegemonic force, and fails to recognize existing hegemonic conflict between the US and the USSR. Indeed, the two superpowers existed, and with their respective hegemonic blocks, to employ historic blocks, to employ another Gramscian term, although a war of movement between them was happily avoided, it had always been a tangible possibility. Possible problems for such reconceptualization is having to adapt a concept devised for analyzing domestic politics to international level. I argue that it should not be feared, although it might have been the case in Gramscian times. First, inside-outside binary position, which is at the core of modern international relations theory, is mainly artificial, as shown by Walker. Secondly, the area for hegemonic struggle is the geography in the case of war of movement and the society in the case of war of position. The advent of globalization brought us a global civil society, and which is already thoroughly investigated. Thus, both types of hegemonic warfare can be traced on the international arena. I argue that any action aimed at inflicting damage on the hegemonic rival or its clients, including sanctions, embargo, military action, is an operation as part of war of movement, while actions aimed at gaining soft power, establishing and financing non-governmental organizations, media development, are all operations related to war of position. It might be an incomplete list, and I will return to this issue later in the presentation. Before we proceed to the case study, I'd like to bring some normative reasoning first. When preventing or quickly finishing hegemonic struggle is out of question, one might wonder which strategy is better in normative terms. I borrow a normative criterion from Andrew Linklater, who put harm to the forefront of normative analysis of international relations. I believe it's difficult to disagree with the war of movement being a more violent and hence inherently worse type of hegemonic struggle, almost by its definition. Next, to analyze Russia-EU interaction in Eastern Europe as a hegemonic struggle, we must first prove both actors aspire to become regional hegemons. Without saying too much about what hegemony is in order to spare time, I use the conceptualization of hegemony as legitimate rule based on provision of public or club goods. So, hegemons provide club goods to their clients, usually including economic development, free trade and security, requiring loyalty, loyalty, reforms, and sometimes a certain degree of burden sharing from its clients. Russia provides security to its Eastern European clients via collective security treaty organization, Eurasian Economic Union, the Free Trade Zone of Commonwealth of Independent States, and bilateral arrangements. The collective West, if we speak of regional level, provides development and free trade via EU Eastern Neighborhood Policy, association with the European Union, and provides security through NATO. Obviously, economic goods are bestowed by the EU, while security is traditionally managed by the US as de facto NATO leader. In the case of Eastern Europe, sometimes called New Eastern Europe, including such countries as Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, to some extent, Russia is ready to provide all types of club goods to its clients, while the West limits its activities to economic development, leaving NATO and the US out of the equation, at least as the things stand for now. EU is a potential hegemon in Eastern Europe, and Russia is another one. At least they both want to be. It's time to continue analyzing the hegemonic struggle between Russia and the European Union in this region. Based upon the types of activities I mentioned earlier, the competition for hegemony between Russia and the EU combines both elements of the war of position and war of movement. Some authors who use these concepts for domestic analysis sustain that although the mixture of the two strategies is inevitable in practice, it should be determined which of the two prevails in order to decide what we are dealing with. However, I believe that it is not the case, since no objective methodology to compare the two can be designed. Instead, I suggest regarding war of position and war of movement as stages, not alternatives. As shown on the screen, considering the array of actions at the party's disposal, we might see three distinct stages. At business as usual stage, the actions undertaken by both rivals are limited to those usually employed by any international actors and mostly consist of diplomatic activities. At war position, indirect methods, sometimes referred to in the literature as political warfare, are added to those in the above stage. Lastly, war movement, alongside diplomacy and political warfare, brings in economic and substantially military tactics, which making the stage similar to what is called hybrid warfare. At this point, since all the types of actions are present for the case in point, I must warn you that I might have experienced bias when devising the list of different types of operations as part of war movement and war position. This part of research is yet to be improved with more extensive literature. Before proceeding to my final remarks, I'd like to focus your attention to the Ukrainian case, which, as I argue, can be seen as the transition from a war position to the war movement between Russia and the European Union. Before the Ukrainian crisis, Russia-EU relations were peaceful and zero-sum game was mostly avoided, while the crisis resulted in the spike of sanctions and even military actions between pro-Russian and pro-EU forces. In February 2014, securitizing moves were made by pro-Russian media and grassroots activists regarding the newly established government of Ukraine and right-wing activists, which were at the forefront of the so-called Revolution of Dignity. Meanwhile, on the 7th of April, Alexander Turchinov, acting president of Ukraine, called pro-Russian activists terrorists, thus making another securitizing moves. Notably, the securitizing moves were made not by the hegemons, but rather than by their clients. It brings us to the conclusion that patrons are dependent on their clients, not being in control of their immediate actions. Thus, securitization is the transition from the war position to the war movement, and it is most logical to suggest that desecuritization is the path back from the war movement to the war position. Having stated that the war position is a better type of hegemonic struggle, I see the normative conclusion of this research as the need to promote desecuritization amongst the states. At that point, we depart from states as the main actors to the civil society and other non-state actors, since desecuritization is not the job of one state, but rather a long process of reconciliation, engaging all types of actors. To sum it up, my research is aimed at proving that war position and war movement are useful concepts which can be easily integrated in modern international relations. While we still lack a theory of hegemonic struggle, stadial analysis moves us towards it. Finally, when hegemonic struggle is almost perpetual, none can definitely win. Desecuritization is the only way out, as it is in the case of Russia-EU interaction. I thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you very much for that presentation. There's lots of ideas to work with in that. We'll come back to them in the Q&A period. Our last paper today is, and I apologize in advance for if I don't get your names pronounced correctly, Furqan Khans and Khadijah Saeed from National Defense University in Pakistan. Their paper is entitled Geopolitics in the 21st Century, Foreign Policy, Nationalism, and the Role of Neo-Eurasianism in the Emerging World Order. Furqan?
Yes, sir, I can hear you. First of all, okay, so the title of our paper here is Russian Geopolitics in the 21st Century, Foreign Policy, Nationalism, and the Role of Neo-Eurasianism in the Emerging World Order. So the paper discusses the prospective rise of the post-Soviet Russia, with special focus on Vladimir Putin's era since 1990s, different actions that demonstrate Russia's ambitions to rise as a great power in the emerging order. And what makes the presentation more interesting, as you see in the title, is the use of the concept of Neo-Eurasianism of Alexander Dugin, who gives a quite radical but interesting geopolitical model for Russia to emerge, what he calls as the Eurasian pole. So we'll be looking into this. Later I'll be joined by my co-presenter, Khadijah Saeed. So we begin with the Russian conception of identity and cultural exceptionalism as per the geopolitical understanding of Neo-Eurasianism. So it takes Russia as the messianic third way and rejects the bifurcated explanation of either Russia falls on the European periphery or it has some exclusive Asian character. So Peter Savitsky is an aristocrat and he is a geopolitical figure. He believes that Russia is understood not as a nation state, but as a special type of civilization that is established on the basis of several factors that includes the Slavic Aryan culture, the Turkic nomadism, and some Orthodox traditions that makes it civilization. So even Vladimir Putin, the current Russian president, he believes in Russia, a special type of civilization and a project for the preservation of the identity of peoples and of the historical Eurasia in the new century. So Dugin believes that there is no general pattern of development and progress for a civilization, but each civilization has an intrinsic right to evolve according to its own logic. And this is what he suggests for Russia to rise in the new order. So this is why he rejects both Fukuyama's lack of alternative to the established liberal order and Huntington's conflict-laden theorization of the West and the non-Western civilizations. So they advocate the pluralistic version of modernity that rejects the liberal order as the inevitable enterprise of human progress and development, as we see. So it treats Russia as an idiocracy where people ambitions to achieve major goals that forms a unique collective identity in favor of the larger geostrategic imperatives. Now, this is the reason the philosophy of Neo-Eurasianism, it defines Russia as a special type of geopolitical formation, and where justice is more important than freedom and collective is more important than the individual. So the philosophy considers civilization as the major driver of international politics. Now, Dugin defines the material dimension of this civilization, and he says that the civilizational geopolitics is shaped by historical events as well as the material geographical conditions of the concerned geography. In this case, Russia, or the entire Eurasian landmass that we are talking about. So this brings him to see the world into two important, what the Greeks defined as the Atlanticist thalassocracy, or the sea powers like the United States today, or the European Union, European powers like the British in the past, and philallocracy, or what we say today as Russia, for its huge land power capabilities. Now, it is these cultural and civilizational differences that brings these opposite cultural poles in a geopolitical and strategic rivalry with each other. So now we further understand this by studying the Neo-Eurasianism and its geopolitical discourse. So now historically, we have seen Russian geopolitics inspired by Halford Mackinder, who calls the region what constitutes the Russia of today as the global seat of land power. Even before the Cold War began, this man predicted the perpetuated nature of conflict between the land and the sea powers, which is exactly what happened during the Cold War. So Dugin takes similar concepts and he considers the inevitable nature of conflict between Russia as the thalassocratic power and the Atlanticist US as the tellurocratic power central to his geopolitical discourse. And this is why Russia has always remained sensitive to the US influence in its near abroad. So Dugin is a proponent of the Hochschaffer's New Eurasian Order under the joint civilizational effort of Germany and Russia during the Cold War, during the Second World War, sorry, as the continental powers to offset the influence of the sea powers from around the world island. So interestingly, now Dugin also advocates Hochschaffer's theory of large states, but he takes geographical and not the racial principles as Hochschaffer's did for his geographical determinism. Now, this is because this Slavophobic racial bias that failed both Harshofer's Geopolitics and Hitler's failure in Europe was described as by Jean-Francois Thiriot. He suggests that Hitler tried to make Europe German. Instead, he should have tried to make it European. And this is why Dugin believes that Russia should not build a Russian empire, but a Eurasian one. Now, but when we ask the question, what Harshofer's Lebensraum, because he utilized this concept of Retzel, that could not achieve for Berlin. Will Dugin's new Eurasianism achieve the same for Moscow? Now, this is the question. So for this, we need to learn about Dugin's geopolitical model, as well as what Russia has been doing for the last 2 decades around this region in Eurasia. So first of all, we look at the Dugin's geopolitical model. Now, it proposes a multipolar and pluralistic version of alternative geopolitical setup with Russia leading this region and that is necessary to defend against what he calls as the monotonic liberal order. So just like Mackinder divided the world's geography into 2 islands, now Dugin identifies and he divides this into 4 geographical zones. First is the Anglo-American zone, as you've seen in the figure. Second is the Euro-African zone. Third is the Pacific Far East zone. And finally, the Pan-Eurasian zone. And this is because this is the geographical limitation of our research. So we'll be focusing on this zone. Now, in these geographical zones, Russia, according to him, after necessary geopolitical settlements, it will win over appropriate alliances like a grand alliance with Berlin in the European grid space, with some radical propositions with Tokyo and the Japanese grid space to create a formidable setup against the United States in East Asia. But here China is interestingly termed as the Atlanticist Factotum. And that is like it should be treated alike with other Atlanticist powers like the US to prevent its geopolitical thrust in Central Asia and to secure Russian security build. Now, lastly, alliance with Tehran is proposed in the Islamic continental grid space to counter the threat of the NATO's, what he calls as the Anaconda Ring strategy by having influence in the Persian Gulf. So now we look into how Russia has been doing all according to this new Eurasianism concept and to what extent Russia's behavior has been consistent with this philosophy. So the Eurasianist has, it has brought a conservative turn to the Russia's geopolitical vision on the Eurasian landmass. Now, this is quite clear from its efforts of turning to the east and improving relations with Berlin, with Beijing, with Delhi, Tokyo, Tehran, its aggressions in Georgia in 2008, interventions in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea. It's doing a lot in the Middle East, its revitalization of the Eurasian institutional structures. So, but we'll be focusing on its geopolitical settlements because it is central to Dugin's geopolitical discourse. Now, first of all, we talked about an alliance with and a grain bargain with Germany. So the post-Soviet Russia has always desired to fuel Russian resources with German technology and to counter the American influence in Eurasia. So Dugin's proposal of the Moscow-Bernal alliance is a kind of a repeat of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And because we have seen that, and Vladimir Putin is also appreciates this historical settlements that even started before that in the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 with Germany. So that Putin has repeatedly tried to defend. And he is happy to have a collusion with Germany that could be based on a broader socioeconomic interest, the rejection of Atlanticism, the reduced German spending in NATO, and the rise of German nationalism because they support the Russians, Vladimir Putin, and they are already doing it by trading in energy and technology. But on the other hand, Washington also alienated Germany more than accommodating it. It is making it even easier for Russia to have a close relations with Germany. Now, we have seen Trump withdrawing troops from Germany and threatening the country with sanctions for buying the Russian gas. So such an attitude and the diverging views on a range of issues weakens this transatlantic relationship that is decades long, and it is taking it to a point of no return, as the Germans put it. So For Japan, we remember Dugin also proposed that the Kuril Islands, that is home to Russia's based nuclear deterrent, it should be offered to Japan as a grain bargain that could restore the Japanese new order in the Pacific. Now, President Putin did exactly the same, and he offered 2 Kuril Islands, and even the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe also sought a state of peace with Moscow. So finally, in the South, the anti-American Islamic theocracy in Tehran, he says that it offers a natural strategic bonhomie to Russia. Now, this is because we see a number of divergences between Russia and Iran in the Middle East, but still the victimization of the Western sanctions, the international isolationism, the mutual dependencies on each other, shared resentment towards the Americans, it provides sufficient reason for them to cooperate. But there are some certain inconsistencies in this literature that we have found. First, and that is not, correspond to the contemporary geopolitical realities we see. Firstly, Dugin proposes that Turkey should be treated likewise the United States by giving it some geopolitical shocks. But I believe Turkey should not be left as a trouble, as a NATO member in the Black Sea. Because having Bosphorus in control, Turkey is very crucial for its geostrategic position, as it is the only key access for Russia's Black Sea fleet to the Mediterranean. So Putin recognizes this strategic necessity, and the Moscow-Ankara deal on the Middle East and Libya, and sheer rejection of the US position on Syria, Turkey's acquisition of the advanced weapons, including the recent S-400 air defense system, threatening the Americans to withdraw from NATO and blocking its Baltic defense plan and shutting down the US air bases. So it indicates a kind of a strategic warm-up between Moscow and Ankara. Now, secondly, if you remember, Dugin also suggested that Turkey should be an Atlanticist victorum. But today's China, sorry, not Turkey, it's China. So, but today's China is more closer to Russia, and it is not a challenge for it. And in fact, they share a mutual resentment towards the Americans in this region. So let me refer to Mao's logic of the East wind prevailing over the West wind. And I think that's what exactly happening. China is coming with the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is connecting Asia with Europe. And that is, I think, one of the fundamental reasons why Russia and China should be coming together into a marriage of inconvenience, or what the Chinese strategist terms as the low friction path in this relationship. So now, thirdly, Dugin exaggerates the importance of Iran and its representation as the vanguard of the Islamic world, because he skips the need to engage other powers in the Persian Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia, which is more generally accepted as the leading Islamic country. So now, apart from this, we have so many other things. Russia's actions includes aggressions in Georgia and Ukraine, its efforts of strengthening the Eurasian institutional structures. But we skip this because of the time constraints. The next portion will be explained by my fellow presenter, Khadijah Saeed. Hopefully she is here.
Yes, I'm here. I hope I'm audible too. Am I
Yes,
audible?
Khadijah, yes, Khadijah,
Okay,
you can
you,
proceed,
Furqan.
please.
So I'll be discussing Russia's Eurasianism and how it is a scarecrow for the Atlanticism. So I'll be discussing that how the weakening position of the US in the 3 geopolitical hotspots, which include Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf, and how it is giving the space to other major powers like Russia and China to enhance the influence. First, I'll start with the Europe, and I'll say that there are 3 elements that needs to be discussed and analyzed when we discuss America's decline and growing influence of Russia. The first is that the growing disengagement of the US from Germany and disagreement over buying Russian gas that we have already discussed early in the presentation. Second is the rise of populism across the European politics, which is of immediate challenge to the US as it supports the Russian propaganda to discourage the European commitment for the EU and NATO and the liberal political order at large. Also, the US is concerned over the rise of populism of the far right and the threat they pose to the European democracies with their authoritarian leanings. Thirdly and finally is that the US and its NATO ally Turkey are at odds with each other in the Middle East and some other regional issues. So the military operations in Syria, Libya, Iraq, and the US-backed Kurds efforts. Okay, sir, I'll be concluding it then. I'll be discussing that how the Russia is doing in the emerging world order. So the contemporary world order is becoming uncertain of the US and the US is on decline. China is also emerging while Russia is trying to rebuild its stature and to have a greater say as a greater power. So in this phase of relative global transformation, where the tectonic plates of the current international orders begin to move, the prospects for an end to the Western supremacy and alternative order are particular concern to the contemporary geopolitics. Also, but of course, that the United States is still the most dominant power, so continues to decline in the global influence as well as in the reputation among its allies and key partners. We have to see that where do China and Russia lie. So I find the ideas of Charles Kupchan complementing Dugin's view of his book "No One's World: The West, the Ruling Rest, and the Coming Global Ten," which explained that the next century is neither of the US, Asia, China, or Russia, but of no one. The liberal order since the 19th century is based on the power of the West and the appeal of its ideas, which is no longer acceptable. This is because of contemporary world is globalized and interdependent and increasingly becoming without a center of gravity. Now, because of the Western values, norms, and ideas are increasingly approaching to outlast its material supremacy by the next few decades, and other powers are rising. So we find out that the rise of numerous power centers as well as multiple versions of modernity, instead of the regional center of the power of Eurasian pole, but still the limited capabilities allow Russia only to play a weak hand well and not emerge as a dominant player. I'll conclude it by saying that the Russia's ambition to improve its grip over the near abroad and Europe of our little success without having a geopolitical understanding with China, and its their willingness to link a single market of Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI as part of their allied relationship based on the multifaceted strategic partnership is very important. Also, that China is potential 21st century competitor of the US in the Asia Pacific and is likely to candidate global supremacy also in the 21st century. So Russia is likely to end up as China's junior, then a competitor, and inevitably requires cooperation and Beijing to gain greater say in the prospective multipolarity. China also needs Russia. Russia's concessions in Eurasia, especially in the near abroad and link. But yes, I'll say that Russia has little prospect to rise to the level of dominance in the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'll have a few comments for each of the papers here in order. Please wait to respond until we've covered all the papers, and we'll see if there's any questions from the audience and go from there. So these are all very interesting papers, and they're linked in different ways. As the title of the session suggests, concepts of mobility across time and space. These are not obvious partners as far as this panel goes, but they do have some things in common. One thing is just stylistically, you can see that a couple of papers are rich in empirical detail, a couple of papers are rich in theoretical approach, and both I think could benefit from taking on board a bit from each other in that regard. I'll start with Aytan's paper, which is very rich in empirical detail and goes into, I think, a great deal, provides a great deal of insight about the day-to-day experiences of internally displaced peoples. Now, having said that, I think as far as this is rich in empirical detail, I think it would benefit perhaps from a wider or comparative engagement with looking at the role, the status of internally displaced peoples in ethnic conflict, particularly in the post-Soviet space, to give us a sense for how this compares with other countries' experiences. And I think this is potentially particularly important in terms of the broader context. And this is something I think that's kind of hinted at in the presentation, but maybe not specifically or explicitly addressed, which is the word perspective in the title of the paper, right? The word perspective, that's a very emotionally charged word, right? And it would be, I think, very useful to go into the national and the emotional stakes that are involved in that element of perspective return. And also, of course, not just what is involved in maintaining that status as perspective, but also how might actual return then affect any national consensus that has been built up around the suspension of return. I think this is sort of points to the fact that right now this is a crucial time in Azerbaijan in terms of nation building goes, and this is intimately bound up with the status of internally displaced peoples. I think that's an opportunity, and I think that's also an insight that you are uniquely positioned to be able to offer. And so I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are on that right now, but I think that's also something that you could build into the paper going forward for if you decide to sort of take it further. For Alex, I think this is theoretically, this is a very rich paper, and there's lots to work with here. I was furiously jotting down notes as you were going through it because it's been a long time since I've looked at Gramsci, for starters. But also, I think it's useful to continually update it. There are some questions that I wasn't quite sure about the utility of looking at a war of position and a war of movement as stages, particularly given that they are defined in part contextually by whether or not hegemony is contested. And so it becomes perhaps a bit tautological to suggest that they are stages when in fact they are treated analytically as distinct. And you could go back also a little bit further to the idea that maybe a war position is not separate from business as usual, but actually it's just a continuation of business as usual. In other words, when you have uncontested hegemony, that is business as usual. This connects even with the realist notion inherited from Clausewitz, the idea that diplomacy is simply war by other means. It might also be the case, though, that analytically these are different stages, but that people are slow to perceive when hegemony is contested or when it is changing. And I think that ultimately is where you potentially have a lot of value to add to this paper, to this approach. So one thing I might ask is whether or not we could understand changes in the hegemonic order to be reflected, maybe not so much in things like organizational memberships, but in things just like agreement over what counts as, say, Eastern Europe or Eurasia. That the ways that we geographically carve up the world and use this as a foundation for establishing control and influence in an organizational sense, and then also the selection of foreign policy tools and instruments, is itself a reflection of different stages in hegemonic order and contestation. The last paper, this is, you probably got a sense from the slides. This is a very ambitious paper. It casts a very wide net. It covers a lot of ground. And in some ways, that makes it difficult to sort of pin down exactly what you can respond to in this. And so I'm going to kind of stick to the things that I know best. And this is, mostly I'm a scholar mostly of domestic Russian politics. Dugin's Eurasianism is certainly influential, has been influential. It's also far from the only voice in Russian foreign policy. And it's difficult, I think, to say that it has, or at least to demonstrate that it has had a constant or even a decisive influence over the last 2 decades, maybe in particular moments, but not sort of consistently. And one of the things that I thought was potentially missing, and that I would invite you to maybe discuss a bit, is how Dugin's theories interact with the other kinds of domestic identity constituencies that exist in Russian foreign policy making. So if you think about, for instance, Andrei Tsigankov's work, or more recently Martin Leroel's work on sort of different ecosystems in official ideology, you have these different competing identity constituencies. And these, all suggest that there are specific interests that are bound up with Neo-Eurasianism that drive foreign policy. Counter to that, you also have people like Kimberly Martin or Karen Dawisha or Mikhail Sigar and sort of more journalistic approaches that have focused on foreign policy as really more reflecting clientelist or personalist networks and those individual interests of those networks. So Neo-Eurasianism might manifest in terms of the individual pet projects, right, of each of those networks, but not necessarily as a consistent state policy. It sort of depends on who's rising and who's falling. Vladislav Surkov famously hated Neo-Eurasianism, for instance, right? But then he was out. So I would invite you maybe to respond a bit to that and ask you sort of like how you see this interface between domestic politics and foreign policy making insofar as where Dugin's Eurasianism is sustained, what elements of it persist even when it is on the decline. Thank again all of our presenters for some highly interesting papers and presentations, as well as everybody in the audience for being here, for supporting our presenters, and for your excellent questions. This is the end of our session. The next session will be at 1 o'clock, entitled Imperial Legacies and Soviet Histories. So thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for